Okay, there are two differences really between the product moment correlation coefficient and Spearman's rank correlation coefficient. First of which is to do with when you would use each one. Now, the product moment correlation coefficient is usually used for objective data which has been collected, such as heights and weights, or anything that you really collect from an experiment, and then you work out the product moment correlation coefficient directly using the data. The Spearman's rank correlation coefficient is usually used when the data is more subjective. In other words, it's to do with opinions rather than facts. So you could think of product moment correlation coefficients to do with facts, actual collected information, data that has been collected experimentally. Spearman's is more to do with opinion, where you have people's judgment, people are ranking things in a particular order. That is really quite subjective. That's probably the main difference between when you would use the two. If it's difficult to decide which one to choose, they'll usually tell you for a start, but the product moment correlation coefficient is usually preferred. The other main difference between the two is that the product moment correlation coefficient tells you about the linear correlation between two sets of data. So let's say, for example, we have some points which are in a perfect straight line. The product moment correlation coefficient and the Spearman's correlation coefficient here would both be 1. Now remember the difference here. The product moment correlation coefficient gives you an idea of how close your data fits a straight line. And you can see here, as you've got a perfect straight line, the product moment correlation coefficient will be 1. Spearman's correlation coefficient, on the other hand, will give you a perfect correlation if for every increase in x, you've also got an increase in y. And you can see that that is the case here. Each time that x goes up, y also increases. So Spearman's here would also be 1. Now let's have a look at another situation. Let's have a look, for example, at data where instead of being linear, you've actually got what is probably a quadratic relationship. In other words, you've got something like this, where the data are more in a curve. Now, Spearman's there is still going to be 1, because every time x increases, y also increases. So Spearman's correlation coefficient will be 1. Increase in x gives you an increase in y. But the product moment correlation coefficient is going to be probably only about 0.7 or thereabouts, because you can see that the data very clearly does not fit a straight line. So Spearman's is all to do with increases, increase in x giving an increase in y, whereas the product moment correlation coefficient is all about how well the data fits a straight line. And obviously, if we were talking about negative correlation, so if we had something like this, if we had a perfect straight line, then both would be 0. But if we had a graph which was looking more like this, you can see again, every decrease in y is a decrease, so they're both decreasing. So Spearman's correlation coefficient would there be 1, but the product moment correlation coefficient again, would be -1. The product moment correlation coefficient would again probably only be around about -0.7.